if you talk about how people are getting their news, how people are shaping their beliefs, this is just a completely different landscape. And I think we have to be careful in the social impact space to figure out how do we navigate that in a way that is ethical, constructive, and a way that is effective.
My attention has gotten really shrunk down to the size of like, what can I actually touch and influence?
Yeah.
Which means for me, I'm mostly focused on local and regional politics and local and regional decision making.
Where's that trust going, right? We talked about this in a previous episode. Your answer I found really interesting. I think that trust, you said, is going to the personal level, right? To relationships. But if that's true, then how come podcasts and digital media continue to have such an important role in shaping our beliefs and our experiences in this world? I'm Eric Ressler.
I'm Jonathan Hicken.
And this is Designing Tomorrow. Jonathan, one of our goals for this podcast was to try and channel the energy that we have in our dinner discussions, where we meet up for dinner, we talk about social impact, we talk about life, parenthood, etc. And I don't think we've really accomplished that fully. We're getting closer, right, in our second season together here. But I'm hoping that we can do that in our episode today, because today I want to cover a really big, thorny thing. And it's not, I don't have answers here. I have a lot of questions, and I'm hoping that we can kind of talk about them and work them through together. So I believe that we are in the middle of the biggest shift in media and marketing of our lifetimes right now. And there's a lot going into that, from AI to splintering information silos and social media completely being transformed, to a complete trust in our relationships with digital experiences and trust and lack of trust in institutions. Things are kind of crazy right now. And we're coming out of, when we're recording this episode, a couple things that I think are especially salient in this. One is the 2024 election for president in America, and how much media had an influence on that election, and specifically podcasts. And then the second is Twitter, formerly known as Twitter X, and the splintering of that, and frankly, in my opinion, the complete dumpster fire that platform has become. Regardless of what side of the aisle you sit on, I think we can agree that it's a dumpster fire. And the kind of the refugee crisis where people are moving to blue sky right now in droves in search of a new home that is healthier. And these are just a couple of examples. If we start to talk about AI and AI generated content, the list goes on and on. So let's talk about it.
Frankly, I feel that my experience as a parent here is informing my business thinking.
Yeah.
Because I'm having to navigate, and so are you, talking about these things with a 5-year-old. And in some ways, I don't feel totally prepared, right? Like, this is all happening so fast. I'm 38. Like, I feel like I'm a little bit like on the older side of like adopting this technology, which is crazy to say, but I kind of feel that way. Nevertheless, it's my job, right? It's my job to understand how this is going to change my business and the impact that Seymour Center seeks. So I'm figuring this out on the fly.
Yeah, the thing that I've really been thinking about is, I mean, I have my own like personal concerns as a human, as a parent, and just and someone who cares a lot about our future and society. But then I'm also starting to think about, like, what are the implications for this rapidly changing landscape for social impact organizations that, in my opinion, really need to leverage media and technology in order to capture attention, to turn that attention into action, to mobilize their communities when everything is becoming less and less kind of like combined in a way that makes sense, right? So one example of this is that back in the day, everyone got their information from a few key newspapers and a few key TV channels, right? And there was some kind of shared sense of reality for the most part, because most people were getting their news and their understanding of the world through these different channels. And that's just not true at all anymore. I mean, if you talk about how people are getting their news, how people are shaping their beliefs about reality, especially as more and more people are consuming information digitally, right? And largely through social media and largely through individual influencers over institutions, this is just a completely different landscape. And I think we have to be careful in the social impact space to figure out how do we navigate that in a way that is ethical, in a way that is constructive, in a way that is effective. And oftentimes, those three pillars do not go well together at all. You can be very effective, but not be ethical at all. And I think that's largely what we see out there. You can be ethical, but not very constructive or effective. So I think this is kind of tough. So I have some ideas around this, and maybe it'd be good to talk about one of my framing beliefs that I've been talking about for a long time, which is this concept of the attention economy. And the attention economy, it basically posits that it used to be true that information was scarce, right? Before especially the internet, a lot of people had access to information that other people didn't have access to. And now the interesting irony here is that the promise of the internet was that everyone would have free flowing access to information and it would make the world a better place. And I think what we're starting to see is that hasn't quite penciled out the way we hoped it would. And now we have an overabundance of information and not enough skill about how to make sense of all that information. In certain ways, I think that our information processing centers in our brains are just overstimulated, right? We're getting way too much information from way too many sources. We're expected to try and figure this out now on an individual level, especially if you don't trust mainstream media or institutions to do that for you, which more and more people aren't. That is a challenge, in my opinion, for social impact organizations, especially when one of the main things that we're trying to do is build trust and credibility. So I know you've been a big proponent of that happening kind of in person when it can. And I do think that there's a really interesting tension here between, as we have this kind of reckoning away from digital information and institutions, that where's that trust going, right? We talked about this in a previous episode. Your answer I found really interesting. I think that trust, you said, is going to the personal level, right? To relationships. And I think that that's true. But if that's true, then how come podcasts and digital media continue to have such an important role in shaping our beliefs and our experiences in this world? Thoughts?
Well, I know that my reaction to the world as it is has been to sort of shrink my sphere of attention and sort of align my attention with where my ability to make impact overlaps.
Yeah.
Right. So, like, this goes back years now, but I was paying attention to national politics and international politics and being really invested personally in those stories.
Yeah.
And I found that over the years, maybe this is partly confounded by becoming a parent, where my attention has gotten really shrunk down to the size of, like, what can I actually touch and influence?
Yeah.
Which means for me, I'm mostly focused on local and regional politics and local and regional decision making. On a personal level, like, that has really worked for me. And I'm trying on the fly, I'm trying to, like, overlay that onto Seymour Center in my work. Like,
Yeah.
does it make sense for my social impact organization to get to equally become focused and get smaller in a way, and really only address the things that we have the ability to address? I don't know. I'm wondering if there's any, like, application here.
Yeah, no, I completely hear where you're coming from. And I honestly don't have an answer. And I don't think there is one answer, right? I do think this is something that really has to kind of come down. If you're a social impact leader, you have to kind of think about this from your perspective. And maybe one way of saying this is, do you need to have an opinion or a stance or a message for every big culture war issue out there, or every breaking news story out there? Like, does your organization need to have a take on that? I think the answer is no.
I agree with that.
I think you don't at all. And
Yeah.
I think actually we all went way too far on that in the last few years, where there was this kind of social pressure that every organization needed to have a take on every cultural issue out there. And, this has been largely, and in my opinion, kind of not always accurately framed under this guise of, like, woke politics and wokeism and the woke mind virus that everyone likes to talk about. And I think that like there was some ammo that everyone gave that narrative that I think is somewhat valid. And at the same time, I think that what I saw happen, and I was really intentional about this in terms of our own communications at Cosmic, is that everyone felt the need to weigh in on every issue in the world, whether or not it had anything to do with the purpose of their organization. And this is tricky, right? Because if generally we are doing social impact work and we want to create progress for society and we want to create a more just and equitable world, which I think a lot of social impact leaders want to do, there's a kind of like a natural inclination to feel like you need to take part in those conversations potentially, right? So if you're doing climate justice work, for example, and there's issues around gender equality and you understand how those issues intersect, well, shouldn't you have a take on gender equality if you're doing climate justice work, for example? I know organizations who believe very strongly that that's true, and I think they have a solid point of view there. But that's just one example, right? And I think we saw people reach way, way further than that and kind of have a take on those things. And I think it was largely because there was this cultural upswell of kind of, everyone's got to have a take on every social issue out there.
I'm conflicted about this.
Yeah.
Because on one hand, I talk a lot about this idea of relevance for kind of the philosophy behind Seymour Center, right? We want people to walk into our space and see themselves reflected in the space.
Right.
And there's a lot of ways to do that. And we try to do that online too. But this idea of becoming ultra hyper relevant to the lives and the attention of the people we serve.
Yeah.
And so on one hand, I'm like, I don't want to comment on everything that's happening in the world because we have such a narrow impact mission. On the other hand, I know that our audience cares about these things and I want to reflect their values and their care in the space and in how we speak. So I'm conflicted, right? Like, can I both be relevant to my audience and not discuss the things that they care about most at the same time?
I mean, I'll just ask a question. Like, does this come down to actual action over some kind of performative action or virtue signaling, right? Around if you are going to have a take on something and make a claim about something, and it, in my opinion, it kind of has to have two backing elements for that to be true. One, it does have to have some kind of logical relevance to the work that you're doing, and you need to be able to defend that. And two, I think you have to be able to support that statement or that communication with authentic action in the real world. And I think if neither of those things are true, then it really is kind of just performative.
I agree. Where my mind was going was like, does Seymour Center have the ability to act meaningfully towards the particular issue or the particular conversation?
Yeah.
Do we have something valuable to add, or can we advance our impact or our mission by becoming involved in that conversation in some way? And if the answer is no, my inclination is we're out. We're not going to talk about that.
Yeah. Okay, so now a counterpoint that I think about a lot here is that when it comes to making big cultural shifts, even just speaking truth about something and you don't have a solution and maybe it isn't necessarily relevant, that kind of power in numbers and message and cultural change is valid too, right? So there are some advocacy focused organizations that are trying to drum up support from, a broad coalition, even if they're not directly a bullseye fit for the mission, but that have enough value alignment and ethical alignment or whatever, however you might measure that, who become allies, right? And so I think there's a counterpoint to this, right? And I think it's squishy, it's hard, right? And like I feel like I know I have a clear answer to this and a clear point of view on it, and then a week later I'll start to question that a little bit too.
I took a little heat for not commenting on the results of the 2024 presidential election from an official standpoint.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and look, the community we live in, I think, went 70% Harris, 30% Trump, and so and I took a little heat for not discussing that or putting out a statement.
Sure.
Whereas some of my colleagues who are in similar positions at other science centers and other aquariums did, and we chose not to. And I took some heat for that. And that heat has died down pretty quickly. But it was a moment of like, oh, this really mattered. And this question of who does this matter to? And does commenting on this help deliver impact? Those were the big questions going through my head.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I thought the answer was no.
Yeah.
But I can see the argument that actually it could have been, it could have been meaningful to building momentum, building community, building a groundswell that may have brought more support to the organization or more attention, or like I can see those arguments.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think like one thing I think about is that we need to have some grace here, right? Around, you as an executive director making that choice and not being, not having a picket line in front of the Seymour Center. There are, in my opinion, I could see how you could have gone the other way, right? There's some obvious kind of, in my opinion, like relevance to, let's just be honest, like the track record of Trump and his cabinet and his appointees and his just general politics and climate action, which is like, obviously a huge mission for the Seymour Center. Like there's an argument to be made that you could have and maybe even should have done that. But I also think that if all we do is just kind of like call out culture around organizations like yours and leaders like yours not doing that for whatever reasons you chose to, like, should we be boycotting you now? Like, of course not, right? So I think as a culture and as a society, we need to be a little bit less reactive around all of this. And I think largely that reactivity, in my opinion, seems to be directly correlated with how integrated internet culture is in our lives, right? The more we are terminally online versus just talking to each other as people in the real world, the more that complete lack of grace and empathy and nuance, in my opinion, kind of happens. And so that's tough, right? Like, how do you make those calls and how do you know when to stand up for an issue and when not to? Because I think the other thing is, if you comment and have a take on everything, then I think it does start to just become, more performative. And then when you do want to put your voice in the mix, it's not as loud, it's not as clear, it's not as meaningful. And so I think you do have to kind of pick your battles there. Okay, another thing I've been thinking about a lot that feels sort of relevant to this is a new term that I'm inventing it, maybe someone else has already invented it, but I'm calling it authenticity washing. And we've heard of greenwashing. I wrote an article probably 8 years ago now about cause washing. Someone else probably had already invented that too. And now I'm talking about authenticity washing. And this is coming out of this kind of new cultural drumbeat around authenticity. And I've been part of this drumbeat, don't get me wrong. And authenticity is the answer right now, right? In the midst of all this noise and all of this inauthenticity. But now I'm actually starting to wonder, like, is that even becoming a new form of performative marketing, right? And I see this in the rise of like almost this kind of like fake vulnerability that I see a lot, where people are like sharing more about their personal lives as professionals as a way to, be more human. And I think there's a good inclination there, right? There's something to that idea. But when it gets taken too far to the point where like people are basically almost just like exposing more of themselves than is healthy. Let's like take an example. Like, have you ever met someone before where you don't know them very well and they start sharing like extremely personal information like really quickly?
Yes.
That can be uncomfortable, right?
Extremely so.
And for me, it's kind of a red flag. And sometimes this might be a result of like trauma or some kind of like mental health issue. And so I'm not here to like judge those people, but I think like that experience is really uncomfortable on the receiving end of that, right? And I think that can be true too if you are doing this kind of authenticity, vulnerability play to a point that is just like not necessary and like too much. And so I think, again, like most things, this comes down to a balance. But I do think sometimes your audience can see through that fake authenticity where you're like trying to be authentic, which is kind of an ironic act, right? Because if you're trying to be authentic, you're actually not being authentic in the first place.
You use the word balance, and I think that's exactly right. Like, what's the reciprocal to authenticity? What's the opposite? And I think that the way the pendulum is going to swing on this, I think it's actually going to have to do with results and excellence. So I think there's going to be, and I've actually started to see this, obviously a very small sample size, but I've already begun seeing this in some conversations with funders, where really it's the conversation is straight towards, I just need to know Like, what are your results? I don't care what you look like online. I don't care. I just need to know the results. And are you being excellent? And are you delivering excellence in terms of your impact? That's my guess of like where this might swing.
Yeah.
But that's at least what I'm starting to see.
Yeah.
And frankly, I don't hate that, right? Like, there's a part of me that thinks that there is probably some balance here. I might be wrong. Excellence or results might not be the reciprocal to authenticity. But it's at least the direction that the arrow is pointing in the few conversations that I've had in the last, let's say, 6 months or so.
Yeah, and I agree. I don't know if that's necessarily wrong, because I think that as much as I believe in the power of brand, I believe in the power of marketing and being strong with communications and having a clear digital presence. And I continue to think that is only going to become more important. I do think that that's going to need to be balanced by actual results and real world actions and real relationships, right? And there's a lot of talk right now about this kind of shift from a broadcasting model to a relationship building model as it relates to marketing. And I think this is kind of the seed of this entire conversation, but we have to like look at the entire landscape to be able to assess like broadcasting and relationship building. It's not just this dichotomy. It exists in this very rapidly changing, in my opinion, kind of just like in a bigger way than ever before, media landscape. And I think that the where this lands, I don't know. I actually kind of worry about where it lands, and even thinking about how much power individual influencers are having in terms of how people construct their own views around reality and beliefs. It's almost like we've given up as a culture on, and maybe even because it just doesn't exist, like local news, right? Like we know of an organization locally here in Santa Cruz who's trying to kind of like really rebuild the local news scene that's been deconstructed and defunded. They're called Lookout, and they're based here in Santa Cruz, and they're spreading to other other cities and municipalities across, I think, California, West Coast.
They're expanding
right?
to Oregon, actually. And shout out Lookout Local, because they're an amazing example of local news. Right. I'm a big fan.
So all that to say, in lieu of that, in most communities, and because of this distrust that is happening with mainstream media, people are forming their opinions based on random podcast bros. Hopefully not only us, right? And please, like, listen to us, be fans of us, but also take it with a grain of salt, because we're sharing our experiences, and there's other perspectives out there that you should be listening to as well. So if you're a social impact leader or organization, how does this influence how you show up in the world and as a brand? Yeah, it's an open question, honestly.
I find myself kind of vacillating between like my personal feelings and my like putting on my executive director hat in this conversation, which is fascinating. But if I just put on that executive director hat, the answer becomes a little bit more clear in terms of how I'm going to show up for my own team and talk about this, which is really just getting focused on where is our ability to connect with people. And where does that happen, and where does that exist? And are we showing up to those conversations and those relationships as the best version of ourselves? We've talked about reasons why, in a past episode, reasons why people might be motivated to do social impact work. And to me, my gut reaction here is, as a leader, is to go to those things even more strongly. Like, why are we here? Why are you doing this work? Why are you showing up to work? And if we can live that in just the relationships that we're having with people who walk through the door or participate in our programs, that's the absolute best way that we can be authentic without authenticity washing.
Yeah. For whatever reason, when like in reflection to that last point you made, it reminded me of this phrase, to fall in love with the problem, right? And I think that really is the core of this kind of work, is that, and I think the core that powers a lot of social impact organizations and leaders is that they do really fall in love with the problem for one reason or another. And sometimes they might lose sight of that problem, or the scope of that problem might increase, and that's just a misstep that can be corrected. But getting really clear about falling in love with that problem, and then a lot of this kind of becomes noise. Now, with that said, I don't think you can just opt out of the way that current culture is working. And I don't think you can just not have a brand or a digital presence or not show up on social media, or have your own newsletter and navigate the way that largely we do communicate these days. Even if you are interacting in real life with a lot of your constituents or your donors or your funders and building those relationships, all of those real life interactions are now happening on top of the context of culture more broadly, right? Which is largely shaping our beliefs and experiences and what matters and what doesn't matter through these digital channels. So you have to be able to hold both at the same time, I think.
All right, dude, thought experiment.
Yeah.
What if Seymour Center completely disappeared from online presence completely, and it was like a statement?
Yeah.
I'm thinking about, strangely enough, I'm thinking about like REI. Do you remember when they did a like opt outside and they closed for Black Friday, right?
Yep.
It was like a deliberate, like in your face rejection of that particular value.
Yeah.
And I think they've stopped doing that. I think they're opening on Black Friday again. But like it was a moment, and it captured their audience's attention or their customers' attention.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking, like, thought experiment. What would it look like to completely divest?
Yeah.
From the internet, so to speak.
Well, okay. Here's an interesting reflection of that. How did that story spread?
On the internet.
Right. So did they actually even accomplish that? Right.
Yeah. Right.
And was that just for the memes and the clicks and to go viral? Right. And was it really just like and you look, I like REI. I think they're a good brand. I think it was a smart campaign.
Yeah.
But if we're being real, like the message was right, but the message spread through the exact medium they were boycotting that day. Right. So that's what I mean by like the internet is not going away. Digital communications are not going away. And I hope that we as a culture can take this moment to like rethink, like, how can we actually integrate in this powerful technology into our lives in a more constructive, skillful, healthy way? Because I don't think that's how it's working right now. And it's ironic for me to say this as a leader of an organization that largely builds work digitally and loves that. And I do have like a deep love for the internet. I grew up on it. I think it is amazing. And I'm kind of sad to see the bastardized version it has become, and thinking back to the early days where it felt like this exciting thing that could make the world better. And now it feels like this runaway beast that is slowly killing us all or quickly killing us all. And so I hope that we can rein that beast in and use it more constructively again, because it really can be incredible and continues to be incredible. I think about so many organizations that we've helped, that the internet has allowed us to help and connect us with, that otherwise we never would have been able to do, right? And so there's this, it cuts both ways. And so this is truly, listeners, been pretty authentically close to one of our dinner conversations. Definitely one with a lot more questions than answers today. I thought it was really fun. Hopefully listeners agree, but thank you for doing it, Jonathan.
Thank you, Eric. This was great.
If you enjoyed today's video, please be sure to hit like and subscribe, or even leave us a comment. It really helps. Thank you. And thank you for all that you do for your cause and for being part of the movement to move humanity and the planet forward.